and welcome to the second lecture of our new CLaME or CLaME Center for Language, Music, and Emotion, a joint venture between NYU and the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt. We started in March with a workshop on music, then we had a lecture a few weeks ago by Psyche Louis, and Philippe is the second lecture today. Thank you for coming. And then we have a next event. No, thank you for coming from next door. We have a workshop in Frankfurt on emotion, beginning of November, and we're planning the lecture for the course of the year, and I think we'll have one on more language center here at NYU in spring. We'll plan with our colleagues. So today's victim is Philippe, who is a professor both next door at one of the, I think it's called Global Distinguished Professor, not just global and not distinguished, but global and distinguished. And this distinction comes from having, I think you would remind me if I'm wrong, but I think from École Normale, as an undergraduate, the rumor has it you got like a ridiculously good score to get into school, which, that's embarrassing. I won't hold it against you. And Philippe got a PhD at MIT, and subsequently I think a professor in UCLA, and runs a research center in Jean-Nicod in Paris, but comes back and forth between Paris and here. And is of course well known as a semanticist, but has been very bold and innovative about thinking things in broader terms by working not just on semantics in the context of language, but also looking at sign language and in music and at other bold ideas. So that's what we're going to hear about today. Super semantics, or super duper possibly. Thank you, and thanks for coming and accepting the invitation.
Thank you very much. So it's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I will be talking about musical meaning. We'll be using tools from super semantics, which is essentially this relatively recent attempt to study with the general tools of formal semantics from linguistics certain non-standard objects, including gestures, which will play a role in today's discussion. So I should start by saying that this is part of a collaborative project that has been going on for several years with Archer Binetto, who is a young composer in France. And basically, I will be using at multiple junctures modifications of existing excerpts of classical music. And this is entirely thanks to him, in the sense that he rewrote them as part of a collaboration, which was scientific in nature. So I will be making today the following claims. Music has a meaning in the usual sense. And what I have in mind is that it can convey information about the extra musical world. But musical meaning is mostly produced by different means than linguistic meaning. And I'll be highlighting the differences. Musical meaning is usually abstract in the simple sense that it holds true of very diverse situations. Still, there's a difference between an abstract meaning and no meaning. And I will argue that its effects can be assessed by the method of minimal pairs, which, when you're dealing with real music, involves rewriting the real music in various ways to test what happens if you modify some of its normal properties, particularly on the meaning side. I will further suggest that music semantics can benefit from new tools from super semantics, the study of meaning beyond spoken language, and in fact beyond language as well. And I will discuss a case study pertaining to referential indices, sometimes called discourse reference, in language, in pictures, and in music. And then I will suggest, more speculatively, that when accompanying other mediums, such as film, music might have the same kind of semantic effects as gestures when they accompany speech. So, just so that we're all on the same wavelength, I should remind you of the terminology. Syntax has to do with what is well-formed, so in language, which series of words are acceptable or grammatical. Semantics has to do with what the form says about the world. And a key idea in contemporary semantics has been to reduce the notion of meaning to the notion of truth conditions. In other words, we analyze the meaning in terms of, we analyze the meaning of a sentence in terms of the set of situations in which that sentence is true. Hence the dictum, to know the meaning of a sentence is to know in what situations it is true. But there is absolutely no reason why you couldn't extend this view from sentences to other meaning-bearing forms, including music. Now, there are two forms of semantics which are going to be crucial here. One is what people often call compositional semantics, as it is used in human language. It is made of rules that allow you to derive the meaning of complex sentences from the meanings of their parts. And an example of such rules is given here on the slide. These are just the meaning rules for and or. These are the same rules that you would find in logic, and they are essentially adopted without modification in contemporary linguistics. So, you know the meaning of F and G because to know the meaning of and is to know that a sentence F and G is true, just in case F and G are both true. And you can modify this for disjunctions. Now, there is another sort of meaning which has to do with iconic semantics. And we'll see cases in which iconic semantics exists in completely non-linguistic mediums, such as pictures. But in fact, there is a tiny bit of iconic semantics in speech. And you can see this by way of the distinction between the talk was long, the talk was long, the talk was long, or even conditionals. The talk is long, I might stay. But if it's long, I won't. And what the length of the vowel does in these cases is it modulates the meaning of long from long to very long. Okay? And you can check that this is genuinely an iconic rule in the sense that it's by virtue of the resemblance between the adjective and something which it denotes, here basically a duration, that you produce these meaning modifications. So of course, the meaning of long itself, the word is arbitrary, but then the modulation that you perform is not arbitrary, and you can check this because if you say the talk was short, it completely doesn't work. And the rule that we're making use of in this case is that essentially, if a certain realization A1 of the adjective is longer than A2, then A1 denotes a longer duration, a longer period than does A2. And this could seem to be a little bit marginal in spoken language. It's typically far richer in sign language, which essentially has the same types of grammatical and logical resources as spoken language. So it's not at all the case that sign language is all iconicity. It's basically the same kinds of grammar, the same kind of logic. But on top of this grammar, on top of this logic, you typically have richer iconic representations. Okay, and here I've given you an example from American Sign Language for reasons of time. I'm not going to display the video, but the example goes like this. It's something like my group grew. And this is the verb to grow. It's an arbitrary word of American Sign Language. It would have a different form in other sign languages. However, you can modulate this verb in an iconic fashion. So you could modulate it in terms of how broad the endpoints are. So it could be, it could be grow, it could be grow, it could be grow. And you would have three different meanings pertaining to the final state of the growth And you can modulate the speed as well. So there would be a difference between grow and grow. The first one would pertain to a relatively normal growth process, and the second one to a fast growth process. And so here, the way we enrich the meaning of this word is by way of two further rules, right? One is if a realization of grow is broader than another, then the first one denotes a larger growth than the second one. And if a realization of grow is faster than another, the first one denotes a faster growth than the second one. Again, we'll make use of this, of preservation rules of this form. Now, when we turn to music semantics, a recent proposal that I made, which has been developed, improved on, criticized by others, is that a music semantics can be developed but based on a non-standard notion of meaning. So the idea is that the meaning of an auditory percept is the set of inferences, its licenses, and its causal sources, which roughly correspond to the voices in Western classical music. Now the notion of a causal source is going to have to be fairly abstract, because when we study the meaning of a piece, and I'll give several examples later, we're not interested in the inferences that we can draw about the cellist and the pianist or the conductor. We're interested in something more abstract. So these causal sources are really virtual causal sources. This, in turn, is an idea that goes back to Bregman's auditory scene analysis. So this semantics resembles, but is more general than an iconic semantics. Okay, to a certain extent, you can think of an iconic semantics in the visual domain as a system whereby you interpret the visual trace of an event, and here it will be something like the auditory trace of an event. So this source-based semantics for music has been argued to have basically two components. So normal auditory cognition, licenses, inferences, and virtual sources. Okay, and so I'll give multiple examples of this, but typically the lower frequency sound is going to be associated with a source which is larger, because in nature, larger animals tend to produce lower frequency sounds. But in addition, these virtual sources are understood to be located in an abstract space, basically isomorphic to tonal pitch space, which means that specifically musical properties, such as stability, attraction, etc., will play a role in the semantics. And this, in fact, goes back to a different kind of idea, developed in various ways by Fred Lerdahl, Mark Steedman, and others, is that you can see music as a journey through tonal pitch space, and you can interpret positions of tonal stability or instability, consonant sounds, dissonant sounds, in a semantic fashion. So this is all a bit abstract, so I want to give an example. What happens in classical music, among others, when you want to signal the end of the piece? Something that could happen, it's not something that must happen, but it's something that can happen with particular effects, is that you will lower the volume, you will finish decrescendo, you will diminish the speed. In some cases, you will actually lower the frequency. So if you end a piece with two identical chords, if you want a conclusive effect, you will prefer to have the final chord played lower as opposed to higher than the preceding chord. Even if they're the same chord, they just differ by one octave. There are also inferences from tonal pitch space in this. So for instance, the cadence is a traditional way of marking the end of a piece in tonal classical music, and you typically end in a sequence which is dominant for 5, tonic 1. And importantly, tonic is the most stable chord that there is in the system. And if you want something which is not the final ending, but a temporary ending, you will use often what is called half cadence, where you end not in the most stable chord, but something which is a little bit less stable, which is the chord R. Okay. Now, all of these things, so I'll give an example of one of the multiple cases in which it works like this. So this is the end of a Chopin nocturne. So here what's very striking is that the speed slows down, you end downwards, and there's a slight decrescendo as well. Now you could take all of these means to be conventional or arbitrary, but there is another way to look at them, which is that there are really ways that signal the end because of what these means tell you, either in terms of normal auditory cognition or in terms of tonal pitch space. So, lowering the volume. Why is it that ending a piece decrescendo is a good way to announce that you're coming to an end? Because this is a way in normal auditory cognition to signal that the source is losing energy or possibly is moving away. And of course, signaling that the source is losing energy when you want to signal that you are gradually reaching repose is a good thing to do using tools from normal auditory cognition. Similarly, why does diminishing the speed have this effect as well? Because in normal auditory cognition, sources, sound sources that lose energy, it could be an engine, it could be an animal, are going to produce whatever sound effect they're producing at slower and slower speed. Why would lowering the frequency have this effect? Well, the frequency tells you something about basically the number of events per time unit. And so, of course, as a source, so think of a rope, right, which is circling very, very fast. The frequency is going to go up as the speed goes up. And conversely, as the speed goes down, the frequency is going to go down as well. And so that gives you yet another way in which you could signal that a source is gradually losing energy. What about these inferences from tonal pitch space? Well, if you think that positions in tonal pitch space are associated with, in a way, isomorphic positions in real space or in some abstract version of real space, if you are in a completely stable tonal position, you are somewhere where you have reached maximum repose. You could stay there, and you're not going to be attracted to further places. And so that's the reason a stable position in tonal pitch space could send a signal that the abstract source that we're positing has reached a state of maximum repose. So, the proposal was then to describe perturbation rules akin to the iconic rules that I described before, and which applied to music are going to produce information. Okay, so this was just, in these early papers, this was just in a way a toy model. I'm not going to rehearse the toy model, just want to tell you how it works. So this was a very, very tiny example where you have 3 musical events corresponding to 3 chords, 1, 5, 1. So most stable, a little bit less stable, most stable, with increasing loudness. So here it's in decibels, but it completely doesn't matter. And the idea was these 3 musical events can be given into semantics in the sense that we can define precisely what series of triples of events in the world are possible denotations of these 3 musical events. And this was entirely done by way of preservation rules. And they were very intuitive. So, the ordering of the denotations should follow the ordering of the chords. not a note if you didn't have chords. Loudness was interpreted along the lines that I suggested. So lower loudness is going to be interpreted in terms of lower energy of the source or greater distance of the source. And harmonic stability on the musical side was interpreted in terms, in simple cases, of what I just described. So lower harmonic stability is interpreted as lower physical stability. Okay. And as part of the exercise, what was shown was that you could take various highly simplified examples of series of 3 events in the real world and determine that some of them were possible denotations and some of them were not. So one example was a sunrise, and the idea was in a sunrise, the sun goes up, so you're going to have 3 events. The sun hasn't appeared yet, then the sun moves, then the sun is at its climax. And the idea was, well, in this case, you interpret correctly the increasing loudness of the piece because you have an event which develops with increasing apparent energy, which is the increasing apparent energy of the sun. And the evolution of harmonic stability can be interpreted as well. Why? Because you start from a point in which nothing happens and there's no movement. Then you have the sun going up, and then you have this point at which the sun is at its climax and it's not moving anymore. And so the extreme points will be maximally stable, and the movement in the middle will be less stable. And so that's the way in which we can interpret in this way the 1-5-1 series that we have. And then you can start modifying these things. For instance, the idea was that a sunset was not a good possible denotation for this crescendo sequence. Why? The idea was simply that the increasing loudness tells you that the virtual source should gain apparent energy, and then the sunset is exactly the opposite. And so the loudness condition would not be properly interpreted. Okay? And you could do this with very different examples.
Can I ask you something?
Yes, of course.
Yes, maybe the sun is losing energy, but the dark is gaining energy, right? So isn't it underdetermined with respect to the interpretation I have? I mean, maybe I'm moved by the feature the sky is getting darker.
So
You're moved by the feature of the sun setting.
All of this is based on intuitive notions of, so ideally, to test the theory, you would need to establish on independent grounds what is psychologically the correct analysis in terms of apparent energy of these examples. I would bet that in these examples, people would say, oh, a sunset, yes, that corresponds to something that gains apparent energy. So a sunrise is something that would gain apparent energy, a sunset wouldn't be. And the semantic part of the analysis is not responsible for this. In other words, it's using whatever psychological notion is going to be appropriate to study events in the real world, and then it's using this as an input to establish a mapping between properties of the music and properties of basically people's view of the world. Okay. To give an example in which the harmonic stability condition was not satisfied, I discussed a car crash. And the idea with a car crash is that you have something that happens and then you have the crash, which is the last event. And certainly this should not correspond to the most stable tonal position that you have. If anything, you should have a very dissonant chord corresponding to the crash. And so this was a case in which you could exclude a car crash from the possible denotation using not the loudness condition, but this time the harmonic stability condition. It is just to say, you can in principle use these ideas from iconic semantics and very, very simple preservation rules to have an underspecified but precise view of what musical meaning is. Okay. Now, at this point, I want to pause and in fact to give further examples in that direction by considering a challenge to this kind of view, which was brought by the great conductor and composer Leonard Bernstein, in fact not far from here. This was at Carnegie Hall, and this was in 1958. So, as part of a series of concerts, a series of programs actually, that made music history, the Young People's Concerts, Bernstein discussed the question, what does music mean? And his answer was, the true meaning of music is the way it makes you feel when you hear it. And I want to highlight that even though you could modify, and I have modified, the tiny account that I sketched before, so that emotions are going to have a place in it, fundamentally, the account that I gave is referential, in the sense that music produces very general, underspecified information about the extra musical world. That's the reason I wanted to give these examples with a sunset and a sunrise and a car crash. And the view that music only has something to do with emotions, nothing at all with information about the external world, would be a refutation of this Freud model of refutation. And so Bernstein's argument was that you can take a piece of programmed music, something which was designed to tell a story about the extra musical world, and tell the wrong story, and it will work just as well. Okay, and so what he did was he took a variation from Richard Strauss's Don Quixote. This variation pertains to Don Quixote with Sancho Panza, mistaking a flock of sheep for an army, attacking it, and ending up very proud of his knightly deed. And Leonard Bernstein said, well, I'm going to tell you the wrong story. In fact, he started with the wrong story, and the wrong story was a story about Superman. And I want to show you the story because it's actually very convincing, and it's going to illustrate the excerpts as well.
Okay, here goes. In the middle of a big city, there stands an enormous jail full of prisoners. It's midnight, and all the prisoners are asleep, except for one who can't sleep because he was put in jail unjustly. And he spends the whole night practicing on his kazoo, while all the other prisoners are sleeping and snoring all around him. You all know what a kazoo is. Well, this kazoo-playing prisoner has a friend who's going to come and rescue him tonight. And this friend's name is Superman. So, Superman comes charging down through the alley on his motorcycle. Then he whistles his secret whistle so that his friend, the prisoner, will know he's coming. Now, as he gets nearer the prison, he hears all the prisoners snoring away peacefully in the dead silence of the night. And over this snoring, he hears his friend playing on his kazoo, which gets louder and louder as he gets nearer. Suddenly, he charges into the prison yard and bops the guard over the head. The kazoo stops playing, and with all the snoring still going on, he grabs his friend and whisks him away on his motorcycle. The snoring gets farther and farther away until we don't hear it at all anymore. And our hero arrives at last to freedom. That's the
Okay, so that was Bernstein on Strauss. And it's now worth actually comparing the story that Bernstein told to the story that Strauss had in mind. And what's striking is that they are isomorphic to each other. So in other words, what's going on is that indeed the music has a meaning which is way too abstract to single out the Don Quixote story. And in fact, you can play the music for yourselves. Unless you read the description, you'll be hard-pressed to infer exactly what's going on. And there's a good reason for this. The reason is that music is abstract, right? It is true of highly diverse sequences of events. So before I mentioned, the sunset but not the sunrise, but in fact, in the little exercise I mentioned before, I used as well as boat approaching versus a boat departing. And the interpretation of the principles was a bit different, but this was to emphasize the point that even something as simple as the 151 series as described before is going to be true not just of a sunset, but also of a boat approaching and of multiple completely different things. And now when we look at the details, here is the correspondence between the Superman story and the Don Quixote story. So in the Strauss view, at least told by Bernstein a little bit later in the same program, the beginning is Don Quixote departing. This corresponds to Superman charging along. Then you have Sancho Panza chuckling. And here there's a tiny difference in the sense that Bernstein has merged two characters. Instead of having Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, there's just Superman. This notion will play a role a little bit later. Then there's a flock of sheep. The sheep go ba, ba, ba. That's the dissonances that you hear. This is reinterpreted by Bernstein in terms of prisoners snoring. Then there's a shepherd playing on his pipe. This corresponds to the imprisoned friend playing on his kazoo. And you can see again the correspondence, even in terms of the number of characters with a small difference that I pointed out with Sancho Panza and Don Quixote being merged. Then Don Quixote charges at the sheep. And in Bernstein's retelling, Superman charges into the prison yard. Then the sheep run off, baaing wildly, and they become more distant. Here, Bernstein says, well, with the snoring still going on, Superman carries his friend away. And finally, Don Quixote is convinced he has done a truly knightly deed and he's proud, and Superman with his friend at last reaches freedom. I mean, the correspondence should be immediate, and that's exactly what you expect if there is such a thing as a music semantics. Now, it doesn't mean that anything goes. In fact, I think that Bernstein, who maybe didn't have that much time to come up with this story in his busy life, I think there's a small mistake. So, it's one thing to hear the music with the dissonances and the dissonances becoming more distant, corresponding to sheep in the Don Quixote story and snoring with the prisoners. But really, you would imagine that if Superman charges into the prison, the prisoners are going to stop snoring. And so this is really a point at which the correspondence breaks down, and you could, in fact, I think, tell that the Bernstein retelling doesn't entirely work. Okay, but so now I want to actually look at the details and see why it is that the music, as it is, triggers the inferences that it does, and again, underspecified inferences that are going to work just as well, for the most part, in the Don Quixote story as in the Superman story. Okay, so the beginning pertains to Don Quixote, or Superman, departing. Okay, and the original involves an upward movement like this. Here we go. again, you can see that there's this very optimistic feeling that you get from this upwards movement. And to see that it really matters, that if the frequency goes up, you can rewrite it downwards. So there are rules to actually do this. That's where you need a composer to do it properly. But this is a downwards movement rewritten by Archer Bonetto, and it sounds like this. It works perfectly well. This is perfectly fine music. That's the advantage of working with a composer. But the implications are completely different, right? To give the idea of a triumphant Don Quixote or Superman departing to whatever, save the world or save his friend, the first version works very well. The second version musically is fine, but semantically it wouldn't work nearly as well. Let's now go to a second striking example pertaining to the flock of sheep in the field going ba, 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 or for that matter, to the prisoner snoring away peacefully. Again, so here, the fact that there are dissonances is crucial in the music. Here is the original version, simplified, of course, in MIDI file, so that we can get genuinely minimal pairs. And here's how it works. Okay, so there's actually two effects. There are dissonances, and in addition, this is crescendo. The crescendo is responsible for the impression that we're gradually getting closer to the flock of sheep or to the prisoners. But here I'm interested in the dissonances. And to show that the effect, that the dissonances are semantically interpreted, I want to suggest that if you rewrite the music by removing the dissonances, you're going to lose this effect that there's some chaos going on. The chaos could be due to the sheep, or they could be due to the snoring prisoners, but there is some kind of chaos. And here's what happens if you rewrite the music without the dissonances. So of course you still have the crescendo, you still have the impression that something is coming closer, or we're getting closer to something else. And it's perfectly fine music. You know, it's less exciting music than the version with the dissonances, but it's perfectly fine music. But now you've completely lost the impression that there was something chaotic going on. As a third case study, I want to, in fact, go back to the crescendo, right? So you've just heard it in the original version, but here I just want to listen to it in a rewritten version, in which you replace the crescendo with a decrescendo. Okay, and here's the effect. Okay, and the effect is very clear. Instead of something coming closer, something is moving away in this case. Okay. And finally, I want to consider the end of this piece corresponding to Don Quixote, who is convinced that he has done a truly knightly deed and is proud, or Superman, with his friend, at last reaches freedom. And so this is the original version with the expected chord or tonic at the end. And now here is a rewritten version, which is going to be a tiny bit different. Okay, and so there's at the end a cluster, something which is completely, entirely dissonant. And if anything, you completely lose the impression that there's something triumphant, certainly at that point. If anything, you're going to infer that You know, at the end, Superman fell off his bike, or Don Quixote fell off his horse. But the semantic effect of the initial ending is entirely false. Okay, so this was just to show, this was to suggest that Bernstein was right about one point, which is that in most cases, music does not have a concrete meaning in the sense that it's not the case that you can isolate a small number of situations or situation types that make the music true. I think this is, for the most part, a completely ridiculous idea. But the original idea developed was not this at all. It's that there is a highly underspecified semantics, one that you get by way of these relatively abstract preservation principles, whose effect is that multiple sequences of very, very diverse events satisfy the music or make it true. And in a way, Bernstein's point, instead of refuting this view, entirely confirms it. Okay, so now I want to go one step further and go beyond this very simple idea of a music semantics. And I want to now borrow an idea from language, but also from the semantics of visual narratives. The idea is that there is a tiny part of linguistic semantics pertaining to essentially pronouns or discourse reference that has a counterpart in narrative sequences in the pictorial domain and probably in music as well. Okay. So what are referential indices? Referential indices are the logical variables written with numbers or with letters, it doesn't matter, that are posited by linguists to disambiguate the reference of pronouns. Here is an example. Sarkozy told Obama that he would win the election. This is a case in which he could refer to Sarkozy or he could refer to Obama. And linguists have posited that the reason for this ambiguity is that if Sarkozy carries the index B and Obama carries the index A, he can either be understood to come with the index B or with the index A. There was striking confirmation of this idea from sign language, where arguably these indices are realized overtly by way of positions in signing space. So here's an example from French Sign Language. So this is Sarkozy, this is for the ears, this is Obama, OB of the manual alphabet, and it works like this. So it's Sarkozy, and then you situate Sarkozy in signing space. So here it's going to be by way of a finger on the left. Then you have Obama, another finger, this time on the right. He tells him, and now the action is in what happens afterwards. Either it is he, Sarkozy, will win the election with a pointing sign towards the Sarkozy position, or he, with a pointing sign towards the Obama position, will win the election. And you have similar mechanisms in sign language after sign language.
Can you redo both at full speed?
In sign language after sign language. I'll show you a video afterwards of a native signer, which will be much better. Now, the idea coming out of Dorit Abushid's work in visual narratives is that referential indices are in fact needed in visual sequences of visual narratives. And I will suggest that the same thing holds for music. So why did Abush propose this for visual narratives? So she was very interested in particular in the semantics of silent comics, but we're going to be looking at something much simpler here. So Abush follows the philosopher Kate Greenberg in viewing the semantics of pictures in terms of projections. So the idea is what a picture, such as what you have here, B, tells you about the world is, as you would expect, that there is a possible projection from a certain scene onto B. And you can define in this way systematically the informational content of a picture in terms of a set of situations that can project onto the picture. This is a very, very interesting extension of the general program of formal semantics as I defined it, but with a completely different kind of tool, namely projections, rather than compositional semantics, as we did initially. Okay? And you can, in fact, compare the kind of semantics that you obtain in this fashion for pictures to the kind of semantics that I posited for music. They're going to be very similar, even though the principles are a bit different. Right? So, I gave you basically examples in which a sequence of musical events, here there are n musical events, can be true of a sequence of n events in the real world if the ordering of the events in the real world follows the ordering of the musical events. And the loudness and harmonic stability conditions, which I defined, are preserved for this entire sequence. Okay, and I'm not getting into the details, but that was the general point of this analysis. And the way things would work for a picture sequence is that a picture sequence with n pictures is true of a sequence of n events relative to a particular viewpoint. The viewpoint matters because in this case you can see that the projection makes reference to a particular viewpoint. So a picture sequence of n event is of n musical events is true of n events in the real world if the temporal ordering is preserved, and if in addition there is a possible projection of the first real world event onto the first picture relative to the viewpoint, and so on up to the last real world event being able to project onto the last picture of the sequence relative to the same viewpoint. So it's a very, very simple idea in which we have the same general format for a music semantics and for a picture semantics. Okay? But that's the point at which Abush argues that there are cases of ambiguity of reference in pictures that require the use of referential indices, and she uses this extremely stylized example of a cone moving from this position. So the cone is in front of the torus. I don't think it matters in any way. The cone moved from this position to that position. So it's basically coming to close the bottom geometric shape. But what Abush correctly realizes is that the semantics that I have given is entirely silent on the identity of this cone versus that cone. So it could be that it's the very same cone that moved from this position to that position. Or it could be that this guy was substituted at the last minute, if you will, by another cone. And what she suggests is that this ambiguity is similar to the kind of referential ambiguities that you have with pronouns in language. In other words, you really want, in order to capture our understanding, and notice our natural understanding is that it's the same cone, because we probably don't like for this thing to involve a new cone without reason. But if I tell you, oh, in fact, between the two pictures, there was a substitution, and in fact, this is another cone, it's completely possible. But in order to capture our intuition as the same cone, what Abush proposes is that we should actually enrich the representation so that these pictures are going to come with certain referential indices. So here I have OK, I have OK here as well, to indicate it's the same object K in the two pictures. Okay, and it's a very simple idea. I think it's a very intuitive idea. As far as I can tell, it's correct that you have basically this underspecification that we typically like to resolve. In this case, we like to resolve it in terms of coreference. But what I want to suggest is that we need a similar notion for music. Okay, and in fact, there was an example of this in the Don Quixote piece, which had to do with this little tune corresponding to Don Quixote departing and the Don Quixote charging. It was important that it was the same tune and it was interpreted as being the same character. So this is what happened the first time around. This one is going to be Perturbation playing. Okay, and now this is now what happens the second time around. And I think if you hear the music, it's important that you recognize that there is a relation of coreference between these two tunes, that they're supposed to correspond to the same object or unit. Okay, and so this was now Don Quixote charging. So the proposal I want to make is that we are going to avail ourselves of this mechanism of indices of variables. The details don't matter. All you need to see is that I have enriched my little, so what were just musical events before, what corresponded to pictures as well in the semantics of visual narratives, with little variables, right? Little indices. You have xi1 and then you have xin, and you can decide to set these to be identical to each other if you want a relation of identity between the individuals involved. You need to refine the semantics. We don't have to be to look at the details at this point. Okay? And now I want to make this concrete. So I want to make this concrete by way of modifications of a Chopin mazurka. What's interesting about the beginning of this mazurka is that it involves basically 4 little phrases or parts of phrases, which I label A1, A2, A prime 1, A prime 2. That's the order in which they come, but A1 is identical to A prime 1, A2 is identical to A prime 2. And this is really ambiguous in terms of the relations of identity that you want to posit between the virtual sources in this case. So here is a flat realization, which is not going to tell you anything about this. You know, maybe you'll think, oh, that there's a single object, or maybe you just won't know. So here's how it works. That's the one. A2, A prime 1, A prime 2. It's just A1, A2 is repeated, that's it. Right? There's nothing deep. I've put primes so that we can refer to these things. Now, in the Chopin score, the dynamics tells you what's going on, because A1, A2 is supposed to be played forte, and A prime 1, A prime 2 is supposed to be played pianissimo. So here's now how it sounds, and this is immediately going to tell you that A1, A2 correspond to a virtual source, and A prime 1, A prime 2 correspond to another virtual source. Okay, and so now, of course, the identity of the sources is becoming much clearer. But you can make this point as well if you start orchestrating a piece. And I think one of the things that happen in orchestration is that you need to decide what the coreference relations are between several parts of a piece. And this is what happened with written, and so it's the written orchestration, and you'll see that it, of course, follows the cross-reference relations or identity relations that you have in the Chopin piece. And this, so timbre will now be crucial. Now a different timbre. Okay? But of course, course, if you now set, if you write a ballet that corresponds to this music, you're going to have to make choices as well. They will now correspond to basically the ballerinas. And this is what happens in Michel Fouquin's ballet Les Sylphies. Corresponding, so the music corresponds closely or is identical to Britten's version. And so here is now what happens. Okay, and again, same music. The orchestration will tell you what the virtual sources are, but this will have consequences for the dance as well. A1, A2, A prime 1, A prime 2. Okay, so you can see that here what corresponded to just differences in dynamics in Chopin's version, and then differences in timbre in the orchestration. This is going to correspond to different actions on the parts of the dancers.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
About that? I mean, you can hear it that way, but you can also hear the softer dynamic of the repeat as just the same person, the same source
Absolutely.
speaking more softly.
Absolutely.
And that can have its own significance.
So that's that. Go ahead.
So, I mean, how does the semantics tell you which one to pick?
No, so the semantics, so it's not the case that there will be a deterministic relation between the Chopin score and the orchestration of the ballet. There will be some underspecification. I think what the Chopin score tells you very clearly is that the grouping of the events should be that A1 and A2 should go together, and A prime 1 and A prime 2 should go together. One possible interpretation of this is that they're different virtual sources. Another possible interpretation in terms of events is that it's the same virtual source doing different things. But notice you need to make these decisions when you orchestrate or when you write a ballet for such a piece. So in other words, yes, it could be that the score is underdetermined. I think if you are a performer, you make these decisions. Very often I think what happens is that the performer, just as the person orchestrating the music, has to make these decisions. But it doesn't mean that everything is written in the score.
But the point is that which inferences you're licensed to make by the purely musical properties by themselves are not determined.
So it could absolutely be that just as in our initial example in English, where Sarkozy told Obama that he would win the election, the language on its own does not tell you which co-reference relations you have. In sign language you do, in English you don't. And I think exactly the same thing happens in music. I will come back to these points in the question period because I'm a little bit short on time. So the conclusion at this point is that we can enrich our understanding of music semantics by way of a limited device that comes from language but also from the semantics of visual narratives. Now I want to discuss briefly another device which I think can be very useful, and it pertains to something else. It pertains to the case in which music accompanies another medium. And here I want to borrow a tool from the semantics of co-speech gestures. So I'll try to give you a very simple summary of this. What matters is this. Just focus on a co-speech gesture. Suppose you say, your brother I will punish. This clearly has different implications from your brother I will punish. So, with apologies for the violent examples, it is clear that the first one tells you that the punishment will involve some kind of violence. Okay, and you might think that this means the same thing as, for instance, your brother I will punish like this. Okay. However, there is something interesting going on, which is what happens in a question. So, if I ask you, my brother, will you punish? It's different from my brother, will you punish? right, both ask whether there is a punishment, but the second one takes for granted that if there is a punishment, this will be a violent punishment. And it's kind of interesting that this inference gets preserved, because this is a question. Normally, in questions, all bets are off. But there is this inference that you preserve, and this is very different from what would happen if I were to ask, my brother, will you punish like this? Okay. This certainly does not give rise to the inference that if there is punishment, it will involve slapping, or it will involve a violent action. In fact, that's what I'm asking. By contrast, if I say, my brother, will you punish, you get this inference that if there is punishment, it will be a violent punishment. Okay. So this has been taken by recent research to be a characteristic property of closed speech gestures. They give rise to conditionalized inferences if punishment, then violence in this case. And furthermore, these inferences are preserved in all sorts of environments where normal entailments are usually not preserved. So, for instance, they're preserved in questions, they're preserved under negation, etc. So, the multiple examples that make this point, and this is in fact something that you can probably replicate with other kinds of mediums. So, if I tell you what will happen next, will asterisk do what's needed? You don't know what I assume that asterisk should do. But now if I tell you the following, what will happen next? Will asterisk do what's needed with this picture? You understand, I think, pretty strongly that I assume that if asterisk does what's needed, asterisk will drink the magic potion. Again, what I want to highlight is that this is the same kind of inference that we saw with the gesture before. In other words, you get a conditionalized inference of the form, if asterisk does what's needed, then asterisk will do as is shown by the picture. Asterisk will drink for the magic. This is interesting because this suggests that we're dealing with something more general, which is that when a certain form, which could be a gesture or a picture, modifies language, it seems to trigger these particular kinds of inferences. They happen to be called co-suppositions in the recent literature, but they trigger these inferences which are conditionalized and preserved in all sorts of environments. Okay. Question, can we go further? So I think, yes, we can go further. There is an attempt by Rob Pasternak, which is to replace pictures, and in fact, to replace pictures or gestures with sound. Okay, and so here's one of his own examples. So this is now negation, not a question. It hopefully doesn't matter.
The soldier will not assassinate his target.
Okay, so of course, if you had said the soldier will not assassinate his target, you wouldn't have information about the nature of the violent action performed. But of course, here what you see is that there's some kind of explosion, and so you get the inference that if the soldier were to assassinate his target, it would be via an explosion. And this is again exactly the same kind of inference that we saw. It is conditionalized. It is of the form, if the soldier assassinates his target, then the content of the sound will hold. And this is preserved here under negation before it was in questions. Again, don't particularly matter. Okay? So now there are several things that you could ask. You could ask whether Pasternak's idea works if you replace sound with music, and he hinted at the beginning, from the start, that the effect that he got with sound should be obtained with music. It's just harder. If you're interested in the question period, I will give you my own attempts to do this with music. I don't know whether they work very well, and whether the specialist is Rob Pasternak. But what I want to do to close this discussion is discuss what happens when music combines with film. And I want to suggest that when music combines with film, it might trigger exactly the same kind of inference, at least in some cases. Okay, so what am I the way to do this is I need to do something a little bit complicated. I need to put an excerpt of a film within a question. Why do I need a question? Because one of the properties of these inferences that are characteristic of gestures, and that are characteristic of pictures, and are characteristic of sound when they co-occur with language, is that they are preserved in all sorts of environments, in particular in questions. And then this will help me test whether the inference that we obtain is the conditionalized inference that I was talking about before. And so I'll just give you my attempts. So just to tell you a little bit what happens, so this will be a film involving an ape doing certain things, and this will be embedded in a sentence. So it will be of the form, I wondered, will the ape, and then you will have the action displayed in the film. And I'm going to show you different versions. And I want to ask you, as you see these versions and as you listen to them, do you get inferences about the nature of an action if it were to be performed? And I try to set things up in such a way that the action need not be performed because you're just wondering whether it will be. So here's the first version. Here we go. So, an ape playing with some bones. That's the first version. Here is the second version. Beginning will be the same. And here's a third version. Okay, so now, if I were to tell you, if the ape breaks bones, will this be a terrible thing? Will this be something lighthearted? Or will this be something positive? Chances are that the last version corresponds to something lighthearted. The second version would be something positive. And the first version would be a terrible thing. And all I did was I basically used excerpts. So this is from 2001: A Space Odyssey. The original music is in fact Strauss, and none of these that I use here is the original music. So there was a Beethoven, and there was a Bizet, and there was a lighthearted tune. But what I want to show is that the music gives you a very, very strong inference about the nature of the action, and furthermore, that this is preserved in a question. So in other words, you get exactly the same kind of conditionalized inference that you had before. In other words, if the action displayed by the film takes place, then the content of the music will hold. And this is exactly what we had in the gesture examples and in the examples involving pictures and in the examples involving sound. Okay, and so this is another respect in which music semantics can actually learn from these other domains. So been a bit long. I will conclude briefly. Music triggers inferences about the extra musical reality, albeit very abstract inferences. And this is our solution to Bernstein's challenge. Music semantics can learn from the semantics of pictorial narratives and of course of language, in that it seems to need referential indices to disambiguate certain relations in the music, just as is the case in language and as is the case in narrative sequences. And this already tells you that performing or orchestrating a piece or adding dance to it involving making decisions about implicit referential indices. Okay? And the final bit was that like co-speech gestures, co-speech sound, that's Pasternak, can trigger a certain kind of inferences that I call presuppositions, but arguably so can co-fill music, suggesting that this is not a narrative-linguistic effect, but this also raises new questions about the interaction between music and other media. And last but not least, basically everything that I have discussed today needs to be tested with experimental means. So there are tons and tons of work to do. Thank you very much.
Provoking us. There's going to be a bunch of we'll leave a quick chance for people to go. Okay, Claire, why don't you start?
Thank you very much, Philippe. I think this was a very, very specific talk and full of very good thoughts and ideas, and I'm always very impressed by how you can put together those things. But anyway, so I just wanted to about Bernstein, I just wanted to mention that I think it's actually very typical of his malicious self to make a point by seemingly making the exact opposite. That he was well aware of the point he was making by taking Superman as a counterpart for Don Quixote. And coming back to that, I think that indeed the content is very underspecified, but something is extremely specified in this case and possibly in other cases is temporal boundaries. And this is something you mentioned at some point when you made the relationship with picture semantics. But I think this would be your grasp onto probing that experimentally is using those temporal boundaries and their constraints on the narratives as a test.
So this is an important point. I gave, in a way, a very simplified model of how music semantics works. And the reason for this was, when I started in this business, I wanted a toy model which was completely clear and which was maximally simple. However, this model is too weak. So just saying that you preserve the ordering of the events, that, if you have three musical events, they can denote three real-world events, just in case the ordering, the temporal ordering is preserved. This is too weak. Because you cannot have, basically the temporal distance between the notes has to be preserved in the temporal distance between the events, or at least has to be proportional. So this is something which is discussed in recent work by Leo Bigatti in Paris. And what Leo has been doing is, in a way, criticizing this model because it's too weak and exploring ways to make it stronger without being overly strong. And I think after we have done this work, or after he has done this work, we'll be in a much better position to derive very precise predictions. At this point, I would say this aspect of the model is too simple.
Bill?
Thank you. So I don't know that ballet, so I'm not sure what happens after you cut it off, but the orchestration comes back to recapitulate the first. Right? So one feeling I had was that if it's referential, then my eye gaze should go toward where I expect the principal to come back on stage. And if it's something more like just a same different thing, then I should just expect something similar to the first piece. So like maybe a third person come on, but just a singleton. So really the meaning of those two things are solo versus ensemble, or, you know, but I'm not sure that I fully am driven to a referential
Yeah.
understanding of that one.
So again, I simplify things a bit. I actually only said when you write a ballet, you put together a ballet for the music, you make certain decisions about referential relations. I didn't say they have to be exactly the same. And this is for a good reason. If you know, I mean, New York has this wonderful ballet tradition, so you can watch lots of Balanchine in particular, who was particularly close to the music. And yes, there are a few cases in which the dancers correspond to the voices in Balanchine. But in fact, in the majority of cases, that's not what happens. There is a coordination between the two. It's the coordination that I was using, but coordination doesn't mean identity. And I think there is a good reason for this. It's just like the relation between film music and film is complex. So there's something that people call Mickey Mousing, which they don't like, which is, you know, the music trying to really imitate a film. And people consider, I mean, specialists, I don't have views on this, specialists consider this to be boring. I suspect in ballet the same thing happens. Very often you don't want to have complete identity. So you have this complex medium in which you mentally put together the semantics of music and the semantics of ballet. So there will be a few cases of identity, and they're particularly useful for music semantics. In general, the interaction would be much more complicated, but it is still the case that the semantics of the ballet depends on the semantics of the music. It just might not be direct. I think this is a very, very interesting research question at this point. Jean-Nicod is deeply interested in this, and he actually knows ballet, unlike me. I like it, but I don't know it.
Thank you.
They're wonderful, full of rich ideas, provocative thoughts. But one thing I just wanted to say is that the locus classicus for skepticism of musical meaning, of course, not Bernstein, but Edward Hunslick writing 100 years before, and Bernstein was quite influenced by that. And as you were talking, one of the things I was asking myself is how much disagreement is there between what you were offering and what Hunslick was very skeptical that music either represents or expresses identity. Where that is a claim about music's content. So in particular, you see the way you phrase the conclusion that it triggers inference would not impress, because it of course triggers emotional responses too, but that doesn't mean that they're part of the content of the music. It can trigger inferences because you know various things and so have thoughts about what is going on, but that's not a claim about music's content. So what you really need is the content of a musical passage licenses inferences, warrants inferences, rather than just triggers them. Then the question is, well, so exactly what have we got? It seems as though what you were saying, though it was subject to the proviso about the Chopin, not the Mazurka, which is that in fact there is even there is indeterminacy in which inferences are being licensed. That, putting that to one side, if you thought a passage of music was about the sun's motion, then this passage is, as it were, more likely to be about its rising rather than its setting.
Yes.
Okay. But of course there's the conditional, which is that it's about anything. And that's what Hunslick was denying, the formalist conception being that you don't have to think of it referentially, the previous point. And one of the tests for whether the reference or even an aspiration to refer is part of the content of the music is given by saying, look, you know, if it's part of the semantics, then a competent listener would have to be able to retrieve it. And yet that test seems to fail. That is, the idea that you have to ascribe any kind of referential meaning seems to be refuted.
So these are all good points. I think the situation, as far as I can tell, is the same as the situation for abstract visual animations. So if you know, there's actually a genre of abstract visual animation, sometimes with music. MoMA had this a few years ago. And you know, you can start from abstract painting, look at a Miro. There's going to be a notion of reference that matters, certainly for Miro, in the sense that you see objects. say maybe, Jackson Pollock, let's say, or Miro, there will be a notion of an object. If you have abstract visual animations, you will need the notion of an object. You will have inferences which are triggered or licensed, I do not draw a distinction between the two, about reality which is external to this form. And this could be unconscious or this could be conscious. If it's very abstract, I think very often people will be hard-pressed to articulate it. If it is much more concrete, people will be in a much better position to articulate it. And as far as I can tell, the relation between music and music semantics is essentially of the same nature as the relation between an abstract visual animation and basically the class of situations it denotes. The conditional that you noted is simply due to the fact that the class of situations, the class of models is very large. It's way larger than people normally think. And that's the reason you can almost never say that the music describes a sunset or sunrise, and all you can say is it describes a very large class of situations that share certain properties. If I'm right, these are the properties that you get by way of preservation principles that I described. And this is the reason why you need this conditional at the end of the day. So I'm not saying that the conceptual distinctions that you're asking about don't arise and should not be addressed. I'm just saying that I think this is a far broader problem.
Can I just very briefly? Look, the conditional is, if the thing is about anything,
Yeah.
then it's about, the class is delimited in this way. But the antecedent has not yet been shown. And what's not been shown is that competent listening, for instance, to the galant style in the 18th century or anything, has to think of it as referring to anything.
So I will give.
But, and by the way, you made life a little easier for yourself by picking what was known as program music, Don Quixote, which has a story. So we know that in that case it's referring to something.
Well, actually, I don't think we know this because the issue with Don Quixote is precisely that people would be hard pressed to tell the story if they didn't have access to the context. But let me just answer the full point. So I think the same issue would arise for abstract visual animations as well, in the sense that you could ask, about a Miro, about an abstract visual animation. You could say, oh, if it refers, then it refers to blah, right? Yes, of course. What I would say is you need to look at the details of musical performance, orchestration, of ballet, to actually see that these very, very abstract varieties of reference turn out to be active in all parts of music performance, music orchestration, ballet, etc. In principle, yes, I could imagine that there will be a listener, but there could be a listener, there could be someone watching an abstract painting, maybe a Miro, and saying, I see absolutely no object here, right? I'm interested in asking, what is the class of objects that this thing could in principle be true of, even when it's very abstract? And the fact that there could be a gradient, that a painting could be more or less abstract, a visual animation could be more or less abstract, is something that you will find in music as well. The restriction to program music is purely because we're looking for, the sharpest effects. And so at this early stage, that's where we find the sharpest effects, and just because they're well known. But if you think of the mazurka, this is not programmed music in the same sense at least.
Do you have any speculations about how your model might explain cross-cultural variation with respect to these various with respect to some various dimensions?
Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent question. It's a very hard question because there is obviously cross-cultural variation in the syntax of music, and the semantics of music is dependent on the syntax of music. It's not something I developed here, but it's crucially matters. So for starters, we need to understand the formal syntactic part. Then I would expect that particularly the means, the semantic means, which are lifted from normal auditory cognition, would be expected to have a counterpart in other traditions. And so it would be very interesting to investigate other traditions and see whether the effect of loudness, speed, etc. is comparable. Then when it comes to the tonal effects, it's a bit more complicated, because tonal effects, it's not just that you have something which is a dissonance in absolute terms. This is relative to a key and relative to a musical tradition. And so you would first need to understand the formal properties of the musical tradition in question. You would need to have a kind of tonal understanding of their tonal pitch space in order to see what kind of semantic inferences would be expected to arise. So this is a huge question and a very complicated one.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you have considered the role that rhythms play in this kind of music semantics. Because so I think for one thing, different kind of rhythm patterns can convey different emotions. And what's more interesting to me is so when you were talking about the narrative or discourse relations between music sequences, it's kind of vague that what the music sequences are. But I have this strong intuition that for a certain pattern of rhythms, and if you repeat them, then we can have a clear parallel between these two, and you can feel the changes between the iterations.
So the short answer is I have not thought enough about it. There is there's ongoing work on, in fact, a case study by Jean-Nicod, who I cited, and Leo Zaratsky, both in Paris, was studying ways in which a very, very brief musical excerpt could evoke someone walking, and the rhythm is absolutely crucial, right? Because a walk is something which regulates itself. And so, of course, the natural thing to say would be that, rhythm and the tactus correspond to regular events in the world. It could be someone walking, it could be the heart beating, etc. I don't think this does justice to the phenomenon, because there are cases in which the rhythm is literally interpreted, as in these cases of someone walking. I think there are cases in which it's not literally interpreted. And this is, at this point, a completely open question in music semantics, which is basically how fine-grained you want the music semantics to be. Do you want to interpret every little detail, or do you want something which is more coarse-grained, or do you want things which are very fine-grained at some junctures, more coarse-grained at other junctures? That's exactly the kind of question that arises in this ongoing work, this case study by Migodi and Zaratsky.
So my question is just what's the difference between the musical semantics and what I might also think of as being musical pragmatics? So it seems like there's the fact that you have these two different modalities, the visual and the auditory, occurring simultaneously. That there's a pragmatic inference being made. Two are going to be somehow about the same thing. And so maybe I'm just splitting hairs about these terms, semantics versus pragmatics, but I just want to hear what you were
No,
talking about.
so I think this is totally legitimate. I think it's an important question. So a few years ago, I was skeptical of the existence of the music syntax. So I thought there is clearly a musical syntax, right? It's not linguistic syntax. It actually works very differently. Ray Jackanoff and Fred Leal, who studied this in enormous detail, are actually go to great lengths to highlight the differences between linguistic syntax and musical syntax. But still, there's a syntactic system of sorts. And as soon as you have basically a rule-based system and an intentional agent, there's going to be a pragmatics. And I think there would be a pragmatics if there were no semantics. And so I was interested a few years ago that something that we thought was going to be easy didn't turn out to be easy. So I can't make strong assertions on this, but I tried, or I suggested in print, that there's a notion of contrastive focus in music, that when you have a repetition, A, B prime, and then B prime at some point is going to contain a new note relative to B. You have a tendency to have a little accent, a little contrastive accent on the new note. Maybe it's wrong, I convinced myself, or I convinced my colleagues that this was correct. And this would have been the case even if there was no music semantics whatsoever. Now, if there is a music semantics, it's going to feed into music pragmatics, and it's going to be a much richer pragmatics, which is now the position that I have. But you could absolutely accept the notion of a music syntax and music pragmatics, while entirely rejecting the view that there's a music semantics. This is entirely coherent.
Anti-penultimate question.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think you made a compelling case that music can convey meaning, particularly if the author puts it there. Like another example would be Peter and the Wolf, right? When the wolf comes, gets very scary. Or like in the West, rising notes are often mapped to like elevation. My question is how general is that?
Yeah.
Like for instance, from my understanding, Max Martin makes most of the music that people actually listen to these days. From my understanding, he even uses just words, just as another instrument, without any meaning, just making it sound nice. So what do you think about that? Or is that not even music in your
So
opinion?
I think in general, I think it's very general, but it's a gradient notion, just like it is for abstract visual animations. You can have abstract visual animations that have a fairly clear meaning in the sense that, there were these old experiments from 1946 of a triangle chasing a circle and destroying a rectangle and so on. Hyder and Zimmel.
Yes.
And these were intended, of course, to be very clear.
Right.
The reason they're clear is that there are enough signals in the visual animation that you're talking about intentional agent and that they have certain properties. But in principle, you could look at all sorts of visual animation, and at some point, the meaning is becoming more general, more abstract. What this means in technical terms, and that's really the point I want to emphasize, is that the kind of semantics I defined does not tell you that there's always a concrete meaning for any musical piece. It tells you that there's a class of situations that make the music true. It could be an enormous class of enormously diverse situations, right? And of course, if you have no idea what's going on, it could be that the class is so large that you're at a loss to articulate the meaning.
But they have to share some structure.
They have to share some structure.
So for me, if I may just for a moment jump in, because
Yes, you feel it.
I feel I want to say something.
Yes.
No, I wanted to pick up, it's actually sort of, it was in the beginning of Paul's question, which is the difference between, triggering and licensing may be an important difference, because you can trigger all kinds of stuff. But does it license a particular class of inferences that are conditioned on whatever structural? And that's where I'm not at yet. Although I admire the ambition of the program, I would like to see it license a certain form of inference. And that was sort of where I took that to be going from the beginning, right? So sorry to interrupt for a second.
So,
No, but yeah. Okay.
Well, I just was going to say,
hit him on this point.
if you look at the, you gave the example of ending.
Yeah.
The inference of ending, running out of energy, slowing
Yeah.
down, decrescendo, etc. But Beethoven's fifth ends on huge climaxes very, very loudly. And so, what kind of semantics is this, where it's completely indeterminate?
no, you're making a mistake, because what the system tells you is that if you finish in a particular way in the music, you're going to draw certain inferences about what's going on to the virtual, what's happening to the virtual sources. You could absolutely decide to finish in a triumphant fashion with a crescendo instead of a decrescendo. And the prediction is that listeners, if you test them in an appropriate fashion, are going to derive this inference. And so my bet is that if you take these kinds of music, which are not program music in any sense, but you find appropriate ways to test these inferences in terms of what we infer about the virtual sources. If you finish decrescendo versus if you finish crescendo, my bet is that you'll get a result of the form, if you finish decrescendo and rallentando, etc., you get an inference that the source is gradually dying out, or something along these lines. If you finish without rallentando and crescendo, you will have a triumphant effect, and you will get an inference about a source reaching a goal. And so this is the kind of predictions that the analysis makes.
Penultimate question. Yes, you. Penultimate question, you.
I wonder if you share the intuition that a variation entails its theme, and that certain melodies can be ambiguous in the sense that different sets of chords go with them. And I was wondering if you thought about relations between musical pieces in these ways, and could we use these semantics to get insight on the nature of these relations or vice versa?
Yes. So the first question is easier than, or the second question is easier than the first. So if there is an ambiguity in terms of the chords or the implicit chords that you have in the music, that means that there is an ambiguity in the syntax of the music. And so whatever ambiguity there is in the syntax of the music, in principle, could have semantic consequences as well. So I think at this point, the semantics is not in a particularly complicated situation. The syntax might be. Then the other question pertains to basically entailment relations among pieces. This is a bit complicated because if you think of the semantics that I gave, it's really semantics in which the music is an abstract auditory animation. It's not, a realistic auditory animation, but it's an animation nonetheless. But that means that basically what you're going to have is that the situations denoted correspond to tuples of events that have the same size as the number of nodes that you have. And this is way too concrete an idea in order to give you a simple notion of entailment, because as soon as a variation has a different length than the theme, for instance, you're not going to have any interesting entailment relation as far as I can tell. So we would really need to work on this and refine the notion and possibly work with the notion that there are different levels of granularity, that sometimes you can decide to interpret every last detail of the music and sometimes you don't. And then get in this way some kind of notion of entailment. I should say that some of the cases that are currently being explored by Nicod and Zalatsky in this kind of little exercise of having excerpts that evoke someone walking raise exactly this kind of question, because they're in a way, some of their excerpts seem to entail others in the sense that they provide further information about the nature of the walk. And the question is exactly how to capture this in this kind of framework, and at this point it's a little bit open.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how performance decisions made by individual performers might influence like the meaning or that underlying semantic structure, because like there's a way as a performer to be true to a work or like the text or the score, but you might have like one pianist, they can like be true to the score, but at the same time the way that like they use rubato or the way that they end of phrase or something is going to be a little different from like another pianist that might do it in a different way. And so in my mind, like that underlying structure doesn't change, but that I don't know, like the musical idea is like shifted or the mood is shifted. And so I guess I'm just asking about
No, so in principle, I think the score is obviously underspecified with respect to what's going to be produced.
Right.
But I think what the performer or the conductor does is actually make the meaning of the music, meaning the class of situations that the music is true of, more specific. So to give you an example, it's one thing to finish with a decrescendo and a rallentando. It's another thing to finish without a decrescendo, without a rallentando. It's a third thing to finish with a decrescendo, but without a rallentando. And some of the effects that I tried to evoke in print, and again we'll need experimental work on this, is if you want to evoke a source which is gradually dying out, a good way to do it would be to end decrescendo and rallentando, because essentially the source is dying out, so both the loudness and the number of events and the speed of events is going to go down. If the source moves away, right, there's going to be a decrescendo, but the speed of the events is not going to change very much. It's not going to be something that you will mostly perceive. I mean, there's a tiny physical effect, but it's completely unimportant here. So in other words, the prediction is, as a performer, as a conductor, you need to make these kinds of decisions. So you need to, and of course you could finish in a triumphant fashion as well. Okay, and if you finish in a triumphant fashion, it's going to be completely different. It's going to be, there's this virtual source which has reached its goal. If anything, this suggests that the virtual source, just in the Haydn Zimmel, 1946 examples were discussed before, the source is animate, and so it had a goal, and it has reached its goal, and it's happy that it has reached its goal. That's a lot of what you found in the Strauss before. So you absolutely need to make these decisions as a performer, as a conductor. And similarly, I think you need to make decisions about co-reference relations. It doesn't mean that you're going to settle them all, right? You could also decide to play in a way which is a bit ambiguous, and I think that would be fine as well. But you have the ability to disambiguate some of the music in this way. Of course, the result is not at all that the music at the end of the day will be true just of one situation. This is absolutely absurd. The music will continue to be true of a very, very large set of very, very diverse situations. And that's the sense in which, at the end of the day, the meaning of music remains abstract.
That was a good hashtag. Thank you. Thank you for giving us. Fitting, because you really had you had language, music, emotion, and a whole lecture without any pictures of brains. What's up with that? So thank you for sharing this ambitious research program.